Assalamu alaikum, dear students. I am Dr. Ahmadullah Shah, and my today lecture would be regarding types of variable. In today's lecture, we would be discussing first of all variables, and then we have four types. We have dependent variable, independent variable, and then we have moderating variable, and finally we would be discussing mediating variable. Variable is anything that can take on differing or varying values. The value can differ at various times for the same object or person, or at the same time for different objects or person. This means that anything that changes value, that changes with the passage of time, could be considered a variable. We may take example of variable as production units. We could also consider absenteeism as variable, and employee motivation within organization as variable. Now let us discuss how production unit could be a variable. We assume that one worker in organization may produce one marker or pen per minute. A second worker might produce 2 pen per minute, and a third might produce 5 per minute. So it is also possible that the same member or the same employee might produce 1 pen or marker in the first minute and 5 in the next minute. In these two cases, the number of pen produced has taken different values. Initially there was only 1 pen produced, and then 5 pen produced. And hence these differences or these variation help us to understand that as they varies, as they changes, so hence they could be a variable. It could be considered as variable. Similarly, absenteeism. For example, we consider that today only 3 students are absent in our class, and tomorrow we might have 5 absentees, and it is equally possible that tomorrow there would be no absentee at all. So it could also be considered as variable because we are facing changes. We have only 3 absentees today. Tomorrow we may have 5 absentees, or there may be no absentee at all. So there is variation, or it varies. So we can say that it is also a variable. In the similar pattern, motivation could also be a variable. As the level of motivation within organization varies. For example, some employees may be highly motivated while others may have lower level of motivation. Or for example, a student may be motivated for today's lecture, but he may or may not be that much motivated for tomorrow's lecture. Hence, it could be also considered as motivation. Then there are 4 types of variables. Within variable, we have 4 different types. In the next or in the preceding slides, we would be discussing dependent variable, independent variable, then moderating and mediating variable. First of all, dependent variable. Dependent variable is also known as criterion variable. This variable is the primary interest to the researcher, and the researcher basic objective is to understand or to explain or to describe the dependent variable and the variation in it. We should understand this, that researcher objective is to explain or to describe this variable, because it would help us to solve our problem. It would help us to reach to conclusion or to decide something about our problem. Then it is the main variable that lend itself for investigation as a viable factor. The analysis of this variable, the analysis of this dependent variable would help us to answer our research questions. The analysis of this dependent variable would help us to solve our problem, or the detailed analysis of this dependent variable could help us to reach to our conclusion. Hence, we can say that it is the main or the primary interest to the researchers. Here we have some example of dependent variables. For example, organization effectiveness, for example, job satisfaction and turnover, etc. In the next slide, we would be comparing, or we would be explaining the differences between dependent and independent variable. Now let's move to next slide. Independent variable. A variable that influences the dependent variable in either a positive or negative way is independent variable. Now, from this we can say that anything that directly or indirectly or in a positive or negative way influences our dependent variable could be independent variable. Now, it is important to understand the variation in the dependent variable. The variation of our criteria variable is mainly due to our independent variable. A little change or any change in the dependent variable, in independent variable, causes a change in the dependent variable. This means that there is direct relationship between dependent and independent variable. Let's assume that we have a topic, we have an area where we wish to conduct a study regarding human resource management practices and organization effectiveness. As earlier mentioned, that organization effectiveness could be a dependent variable. So in this case, human resource management practices, for example, training, for example, selection, for example, compensation, for example, performance appraisal, for example, communication, all these HRM practices could be our independent variables. And on other side, on the right side, we have organization effectiveness, that is our dependent variable. Now, a little change or any change in our training system or any change in selection process or recruitment or, for example, compensation or the justice within organization could affect your organization effectiveness. Hence, we can say that the variation in your dependent variable, that is organization effectiveness, could be change due to these independent variable. Now, it is important to mention here, if these human resource management practices are significant, there could be greater variation in your dependent variable. If they are insignificant, the changes may not be then very high. Then we have moderating variable. Moderating variable is one that has a strong contingent effect on the independent variable dependent variable relationship. This means that this variable actually changes the exact relationship between independent and dependent variable. There is already a relationship between, for example, human resource management practices and organization effectiveness. Now there is yet another variable that actually changes this relationship. So it is the presence of a third variable that modifies the original relationship between independent and dependent variable. Example of moderating variable in HRM performance relationship are organization size and, for example, we can say regulatory bodies. Now here it need a bit explanation. For example, how regulatory body could affect organization effectiveness or departmental effectiveness. Now let's assume that within organization we have 2 to 3 different departments. One department is regulated by, for example, Pakistan Engineering Council, and second one is regulated by Management or Business Council. Now we know that Pakistan Engineering Council is a very strong regulator, very strong regulatory body, and established about years ago. And Pakistan Business and Management Council has been recently established, which is not that much effective as compared to Pakistan Engineering Council. So we may assume that we may take it as a moderator in this example of human resource management practices and organization effectiveness, that as Pakistan Engineering Council is more effective, is a strong regulatory body, hence the performance of engineering department could be high as compared to management department. Next we have mediating variable. A mediating variable is one that surfaces between the time the independent variables start operating to influence the dependent variable and the time their impact is felt on it. Basically, mediating variable is a process variable that mediates between your independent and dependent variable. This means that there is yet another variable that exists between your independent and dependent variable. In our earlier example, for example, human resource management practices and organization effectiveness, in that example, we cannot say that human resource management practices directly affect organization effectiveness. Rather, there are many mediators, there may be many mediators that can be incorporated. The mediating variable surfaces as a function of the independent variable operating in any situation and help us to explain the exact relationship. It is important to understand this point, that it is the mediator that help us to understand this process or the mechanism or the concept. Because without mediators, we would not be able to understand what is actually going on. For example, we changes human resource management, we bring changes or we bring improvement in human resource management practices, and it automatically improves organization effectiveness. But we could not understand that what actually goes on in between this organization effectiveness and human resource management practices. So in order to understand this relationship, we have to incorporate multiple mediators in the form of attitudes, for example job satisfaction, for example organization commitment, for example job involvement, and then multiple mediator in other form as well, for example behavior, organization citizenship behavior, for example turnover, etc., etc. Now after incorporating these mediator, now we can say that human resource management practices does not directly leads to organization effectiveness. Rather, there are multiple mediators. For example, human resource management leads to job satisfaction. Job satisfaction leads to commitment, and then finally it leads to organization effectiveness. Now, from this point, we can say that these mediators help us to explain the exact relationship. Now, moving toward the next slide. In summary, we have discussed about 4 variables. The dependent variable, as earlier mentioned, could also be a criterion variable. It is also known as criterion variable. And the independent variable is also known as predictor variable. Moderating variable actually modify the relationship between your independent and dependent variables, while the mediating variable is actually a process variable that help you to better understand this relationship. Thank you so much. Wish you all the best. Allah Hafiz.